or you can be ready to do something to like carry on.
Okay, let's get started. Good morning, everyone. Special announcement, it's Juan Alonso's birthday. But we're here to also celebrate Neil's final oral for his PhD. He's going to talk about drone cinematography. That's an exciting project which was started by Neil and Mike Roberts and Jane, who's also been involved in it. And I'm not going to say much about it. I'll let Neil tell you about that. Just a quick introduction. I mean, Neil is probably, has more skills, interests, and adventures of any graduate student. And in terms of academics, some of you want to just tell me he did this. He was one of the original people working on our LIST project, which has been a big success. He's also did a lot of work with Stu on interactive textbooks, and then he went off in this whole totally new direction on drone cinematography. So he has a lot of interest. While he was here, he's done lots of stuff for me, including getting me up to ham radio again, and I have a license for myself. And then, he's also, I'll just say, he's also been a great member of our group and a particularly good mentor in the Horus program. There are several people here today that he mentored during the Horus, and I think he's done a great job with that. So, with that, I'll just hand it over to Neil to tell us about his success.
Awesome. Okay, everybody. Thanks very much, Pat. That's all such kind words. We'll see if at the end of the talk you guys agree with us. And yeah, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. It's like awesome. This is a room of like all my best friends from so many different parts of life. So it's really great to have all you guys here. I'm going to tell you guys about an exciting new direction in computer graphics that we started here at Stanford University. And this is about cinematography. And cinematography is the art and the skill of making movies. And this entire project is really about how we're going to make cinematography more accessible to people who use quadrotor cameras. So let's just get right into it. The last few years, we've seen the proliferation of these orientable cameras that's carried aloft by small quadrotor drones. I actually have one of them here. And we call these quadrotor cameras, and they have a huge potential to revolutionize movie making. First of all, they're really inexpensive, and this means that they lower the cost of aerial cinematography. On the left here is a mountain biker running down, taking a run down a hill, and he's being chased by a helicopter. Now, that helicopter costs him about $1,000 for every hour that thing's in the air. Okay? On the right, we see a very similar shot, also a mountain biker coming down a hill, but this is being shot by a drone. And this drone costs you about $1,000, and then that's it. Similarly, quadrotor cameras can also give us the same abilities as many other rigs that are currently purely reserved for professional filmmakers. So on the left here is a camera crane. This is used to lift the camera to reveal a scene. And on the right is what's called a cable-mounted cam. And these are used to move a camera along a predetermined path. Now, quadrotor cameras can achieve both of these shots and many other effects as well. But perhaps most exciting for me, we can capture never-before-seen and very impressive cinematography with quadrotors. And this is because they can fly to very unique vantage points, and they can do all kinds of interesting moves in 3 dimensions. This shot is the winning entry from the first ever drone film festival, which was held in New York only last year. If you look at it, the camera does this interesting rotation and tilting through this obstacle-rich environment. It traces out a fairly complex path. I'm actually hard-pressed to think of any other tool we could use to capture something like this. I don't know if you guys can think of anything, but the only other times I've seen shots like this is if we do this in a fully computer graphics environment in a 3D animation package. So this is pretty cool. We're basically taking special effects and shooting this in real life. Unfortunately, you guys saw this coming, it took this crew of 2 highly trained, highly specialized people to capture that shot. On the left is the guy that's flying the drone, and on the right is the guy that's responsible for working the camera. And that shot was created by a company called AeroAstro. We actually interviewed them as part of an exploratory study we did as part of my thesis work. So they employ the world's #1 model helicopter pilot, the guy that won the world championships in model helicopter flight, is the only guy that they trust to fly their drone. And then on top of that, they would have one and sometimes even two skilled cinematographers to work the orientation of the camera, the zoom lens, the focus, all those things. And they described capturing a complex shot like that by likening it to improvising jazz music. And they said, like, everybody has to be in sync and kind of anticipate each other's movements, and it's just really complicated. And this is true for amateurs as well. If you or I want to go and shoot interesting cinematography using a quadrotor camera, well, then we have to do all of this. We have to be the pilot, and we have to be the cameraman. And we have to do all of this in real time using a set of joysticks and control wheels like these. This is the controller for the DJI Phantom that somebody added some stickers to help him capture cinematography. And although these interfaces are very expressive and capture very interesting cinematography with them, I would claim that they're not designed for cinematography. In fact, I'll just give you guys a comparison. This is the remote control that my grandpa bought in 1989, which I have here. And he bought this to fly model airplanes with. And this was back in the day when, if you're moving one of these control sticks, you're actually moving a mechanical control surface on a wing. And there wasn't a lot of electronics, and there was no computation in the way. So we're still using the same fundamental interface today. So we can probably do a little bit better. Now let me state this problem more precisely, okay? So quadrotor cinematography, as it exists today, requires the technical skill of being a pilot. It also requires the artistic skill of visual composition, and you have to simultaneously apply all of this in real time. The work I'm going to show you is an attempt at improving on this state of affairs. I call this cinematography first interaction, which is a term Stu helped me come up with. In this thesis, we're going to get rid of these clunky controllers. We're going to completely automate the role of the pilot. And we're going to do this by providing tools that enable the user to focus on visual composition. Now, a lot of the magic obviously lies in exactly how we do this. And this is quite tricky, since I have to consider both the requirements of the cinematographer, and I also have to match this to the abilities of the quadrotors we're using. Today, I'm going to tell you about two tools we built using this concept. First, I'm going to show you how we can compose shots using, surprise, surprise, classic 3D animation primitives that we adapt to respect the physics of quadrotors. I'm in a computer graphics lab, so this is kind of using tools from our wheelhouse. We're going to use this to build a tool that we call Horus, which is a tool for planning shots. With Horus, you're free from this challenging manual quadrotor control, and you don't have to make any complex real-time decisions. So the user can just focus on shot planning, on setting up nice cinematography in an offline context. We don't have to stop here, though. I'll then show you how we can help users compose shots in real time by using visual composition principles from filmmaking. We use this insight to build something we call the drone cinematographer. With the drone cinematographer, you can film people in real time, again, without manually controlling the quadrotor, and this tool offers guidance to novice cinematographers in the form of pre-composed shots. Let me start off by showing you the solution to this problem of having to manually fly quadrotors. And this is work I did in collaboration with Mike and Juan and Lorraine and Pat. Before we get into any heavy math, let me show you what we can do with this tool to give you a little sneak preview. This shot was captured fully autonomously and created with Horus. This was created by a professional cinematographer who works for Weta Digital. I think you can kind of almost see that. I can almost imagine the orcs climbing up this thing. Now, we're not the first people to try and get rid of these controllers. In fact, the robotics community have developed mission planning tools like this one. In a mission planning tool, you can program your quadrotor to fly some path. You can make it do all kinds of actions by programming a list of commands like what you're seeing at the bottom here. If you look at it closely, there's things like condition change altitude, and do change speed, and things like that. Now, I would think everybody can get behind the idea that these tools were also not designed with cinematography in mind. Although they automate the quadrotor, they're not helping us do cool cinematography, at least not yet. So, to better understand the needs of our cinematographers, we started by interviewing a bunch of them. We got 6 professional quadrotor pilots, people who do both video and pictures, and all of them are familiar with flying quadrotors, and they some of them get paid for it. And in fact, they ranged from kind of novice to expert people. As I mentioned, we interviewed AeroCine. They're part of this study, so some of the people who are kind of winning the competitions is in this. It turns out all of them have also tried out mission planning tools, and they're familiar with that, but none of them have adapted tools like that for their cinematography. From the study, we extracted a set of requirements for shot planning. So from this, we asked ourselves, how do we allow users to do the following? How do we let them plan shots by setting up what's visually in the frame of the camera? How do we precisely control the speed that the camera moves along this path? How do we help them easily make changes to their shot? How do you help them see accurate visual previews of what the shot looks like? And lastly, how do we then use all this to capture this shot in real time, in the real world, using a quadrotor? And I hinted at this previously. We said, well, wait a second. When we create 3D animations in computer graphics, well, then we build a little 3D environment and we fly a little virtual camera through it, and we have all of these really cool camera planning algorithms and tools to do this. Why don't we just use that? Why don't we just use 3D animation primitives to fly a quadrotor? Like, genius, done, I can go home, right? And I almost can, because for those of you who've ever done any kind of 3D animation, yes, you can plan shots visually, you can control the timing, you can rapidly iterate on shots, but unfortunately, these aren't built for quadrotors. So they won't show you an accurate visual preview, and they don't let you go capture a shot autonomously. Let me give you a little bit of intuition about why this is the case. So here in red is a camera path that you might set up in some 3D animation software. That seems innocent enough that some path your quadrotor has to fly. But let's take a look at what can go wrong. I'm going to say the intended position of our camera is this little pink dot, and the actual position of the real quadrotor in the real world is this blue dot. Now, maybe it's a nice and slow, dramatic shot moving around this building, and then everything seems fine. Where we want the camera to be and where the camera actually is just follows each other very nicely. But what if it's a very fast and exciting shot? Well, it could be too fast for a quadrotor, right? This kind of intuitively makes sense. And in that case, what will happen? Well, I'm not sure, but one possible thing is that the quadrotor can cut a corner and hit our building, okay? So that seems bad, and even worse, this means that the visual preview that I generated that said, well, this is how your shot's going to look like, is going to be completely wrong, okay? And so my tool's not going to be very good if what I tell you you're going to see, you're not actually going to get, right? So if we don't take the dynamics of our quadrotor into account, our virtual preview might be wrong. So this is the approach we're going to take. We're going to invent a shot planning interface based on the concepts of 3D animation. And then we're going to take those 3D animation principles and we're going to adapt them to respect quadrotor physics. And I'm going to try today to give a talk about physics without ever using an equation. We'll see if I get all the way through. If we do this, then we're home free, okay? So we can actually do something else too. If we adapt these primitives to support and respect the quadrotor physics, we can also tell you how your quadrotor will behave along this path. And it turns out that this can be quite useful. So this is Horus. Let me walk you through how this tool works. While I said that we want to give you visual shot planning, and we start off by providing you this virtual environment in which you can set up shots. We use the Google Earth data set, so we have a pretty decent 3D data of most of the US and actually big chunks of the world. The user can place a virtual camera by moving this 3D interface around, and they do this by specifying the visual composition of a shot at a few representative moments, which we call keyframes. Each keyframe is 2 points. It's the position the camera looks from and the position the camera looks at. We turn these keyframes into a shot by interpolating a path between these look from and look at points. And the real magic lies in how we find this path to make sure that the quadrotor can follow it. I'll dig into that in a second. I'm showing these paths in green and 3D on the left and 2D on the right, and you can actually click and drag them around if you want to tweak your shot. Horus lets the user precisely control the timing of their shot by editing these two easing curves, or progress curves. we have a progress curve on the left for the look from path and on the right for the look at path. And so this encodes just how fast the quadrotor moves along this path. So on the x-axis is time, on the y-axis is progress along the trajectory of moving. On the right, we then provide a set of feasibility plots. This displays the quadrotor's physical behavior along this path. So things like, what's the horizontal and vertical velocity, what's the acceleration, what's your altitude above sea level, things like that. If your shot were to move too fast, you could see that on these plots. Horus will render a 3D preview of your shot in real time. So you can grab a little scrubber and look at what your shot will look like. And we do calibrate this to the camera we're using. And then finally, with one click, you can autonomously capture the shot you've set up. All you have to do is just hit the go button. While we're capturing, the user can pause, you can abort, and in the paper we even show how you can tweak the timing of the shot as well. So we do all this, how do we respect the physics of quadrotor cameras? Let me draw you a little cartoon, okay? It's a cartoon, so I'm going to oversimplify things, but we'll get the important points across without filling out the board of equations. In Horus, the user starts by setting up these keyframes. Every keyframe is a look from point, which I'm showing with these camera icons, and a look at point, which is little stars. The user also creates a progress curve, which tells you how quickly you need to move between these different keyframes. We now want to find a look from and a look at trajectory, then interpolate these keyframes and move the quadrotor according to this progress curve. Now, to be able to fly these trajectories, I have to make sure of a couple of things. I have to make sure it's possible for the quadrotor to tilt and rotate and accelerate in a physically plausible way. We describe how a quadrotor can tilt and accelerate using a set of equations. We call the equations of motion. And so if a curve satisfies those, then we say, well, the curve satisfies the equations of motion of a quadrotor. We also have to make sure that this progress curve doesn't move the quadrotor too aggressively. And we describe how aggressive a quadrotor can move by specifying what we call control limits. Okay, so we have the equations of motion and control limits. And a good trajectory is one that satisfies the equations of motion and stays within the control limits. And we call such trajectories physically feasible. So I can now state this problem a little bit more precisely. How do we generate physically feasible trajectories for quadrotor cameras? So luckily for us, it turns out that we know quite a bit about quadrotor trajectories. In fact, quadrotors have this really surprising property. Okay? As long as for any of these curves, you can take a fourth derivative, then it satisfies the quadrotor's equations of motion. This is a really cool result that a couple people have demonstrated by now. But we don't have just a quadrotor, so we're not quite there yet. We have a quadrotor camera, and so we also need to consider how we rotate the camera. And how do we make this follow a look at and look from path? Secondly, we give users this fine-grained timing control. So how do we handle any control limit violations that can happen? What happens if I set up a path, if I set up a progress curve that makes the quadrotor fly too fast? I'm just going to start by adding the camera. We built a physical model of a quadrotor camera, and this model describes all the physical characteristics in detail. Using this model, we proved that the same continuity requirement for a quadrotor's position path also holds for the look from and the look at path. So it turns out that as long as both of these trajectories has something that's called C4 continuity, which is just a fancy way of stating that the fourth derivative of both of these trajectories exists, then I can solve for how to fly and how to orient the quadrotor. For the sake of brevity, I'm not going to discuss the full proof, but if anybody's interested, I'll refer them to our SIGGRAPH Asia paper where we show this in detail. This is more continuity than we typically use in computer graphics applications. Mostly we don't generate curves that has the C4 continuity. And for this reason, we couldn't use any of the kind of standard 3D camera path planning algorithms. So to generate these C4 continuous trajectories from our input keyframes, we interpolate them using C4 continuous splines. And we do this by optimizing the smoothness of these C4 continuous splines using a convex quadratic program. If you're curious about the specific formulation, it was also in our paper. Now, the trajectories we generate, they will satisfy the equations of motion, but they won't necessarily satisfy our control limits. So I can still go too fast. We're we're going to account for this by displaying the control forces for the trajectory in our user interface. In case the user's trajectory exceeds any of these physical limits, the user can adjust their trajectories to be less aggressive. So just to summarize, we overcame the challenge of generating physically feasible trajectories by extending a previous proof for quadrotors so that it also applies to quadrotor cameras. Then we showed how we can use the standard look at and look from camera model to generate trajectories, and we show how to handle control limits by providing visual feedback to the user. So, in other words, we can generate paths that some quadrotor can follow, but if it's moving too fast for the one you have, our interface will tell you. There's an interesting implication here, which says this. It turns out that now, using keyframes and easing curves, we can express any trajectory that a quadrotor camera can follow. So we moved away from the little control sticks, but we didn't give up any expressiveness, which is kind of nice. Now, we built all of this into a tool for real, and I'd like to show you now that this actually works. We conducted an informal user study with 4 participants. 2 of them were novice cinematographers that did not have any experience flying quadrotors, and 2 were professional cinematographers with extensive experience that gets paid for manually flying quadrotors. We tasked each participant to create 2 shots, which they got 90 minutes for. For the first shot, we asked them to capture a large bell tower here on campus. And for the second shot, we said, we'll capture anything on Stanford's campus, just make it challenging and impressive and try to do something cool. Which got us into trouble. We also asked them, mostly with the law. We also asked them to make sure that their shots were feasible, so within the physical limits of the quadrotors. The participants then captured their shots fully autonomously, and after capture, we got these experts who knew how to fly quadrotors very well and said, well, take a look at these shots. What makes them hard to capture if you were to fly them by hand? Now from the study, I'm going to try to answer a couple of questions. How effective was this visual preview we gave people? How did subjects use this feasibility feedback we displayed? Did they manage to use this to make their shots feasible, and how did they respond to it? And finally, well, did we actually get cool shots? Did people do impressive cinematography? Let me first just give you an idea of our visual preview. On top is the render out of Horus. At the bottom is a quadrotor filming the actual shot. You can see it matches pretty well. Sometimes we don't match super well, though. Here's an example where on top, in the 3D preview, you can see the top of this bell tower, and at the bottom, that's cut off. Okay, there's a couple things going on here. First of all, we do depend on Google Earth, and their 3D models aren't perfect. In fact, we've sometimes seen multiple meter offsets from things. And we are using standard GPS-based trajectory following. GPS is not perfect, so your quadrotor might not follow the trajectory quite perfectly. And I'll mention a couple ideas we have about how to improve this. We presented the quadrotor's behavior on the set of feasibility plots. And so the user can guarantee that the shot is feasible by looking at these plots, and if they're going too fast or violating some limit, they can relax their inputs. Some participants actually identify these plots as their favorite part of the tool, and I said, oh, this is great, like I kind of understand what my quadrotor is doing. We then took a look at how people went through their editing session, which we recorded, to understand how they went about using these plots. Well, first of all, everybody did manage to create feasible shots. Nobody could not respond to this and was completely stuck, so people could respond. That was good. Interestingly enough, people did some complex behavior. Okay? In many cases, people just slow their shot down. Say, well, this is too fast, I'll just slow it down. Sometimes people did a little bit of tweaking on the trajectory. For example, one user said, well, okay, I'm trying to drop my quadrotor from 400 feet down to 100. And when we said, well, you can't go that fast, he said, well, it's fine, I'll drop from 200 feet without changing the speed of the shot. And sometimes people say, well, okay, I'm giving up on this, I'm going to create a completely different shot. And I thought about this for a while, and I think it kind of intuitively makes sense where when you're busy using some camera technology, you're saying, well, can I get this shot? Not quite. Okay, I'm going to try something completely different, or not quite, but I'm happy with it. Automating this process would be tricky, but I actually want to mention a cool extension that some of my colleagues have made to this since we published this paper, which is Mike and Pat, who are both in the room, have since shown how you can automate this example of time stretching things. So their work is a really nice addition to our tool because this further supports rapid iteration. Now, if you're going too fast, you can say, well, let's just time stretch it quickly and see what that looks like. And if you like it, go fly it. And if you say, well, this doesn't feel like the shot I want anymore, you can go and redesign it. This is all built into the same system, which is open source and available online, by the way. But lastly, and probably most importantly, I want to convince you that we enabled cinematographers, both novice and experts, to go capture really exciting shots. So I'm going to show you a variety of the results that these people produced. And I'll also share with you what the experts said, well, this is why I would have a tough time capturing this. This is the shot I showed you already. And our expert explained that this is pretty challenging because I'm busy reorienting the quad while I'm flying in this arc that kind of gets closer and further away from the tower. So I'm going to be using all my controls at the same time to do this. It all gets pretty close to the shot, to the tower, so I do stand a chance of if I'm making a mistake, I could hit the tower and destroy my book. No good. So this was set up by an expert. This was set up by one of my lab mates who knows a lot about computer graphics, but has never flown a Quadrotor. And interestingly enough, this shot has some similar characteristics. You also see this arcing behavior and this kind of complex path being traced out. And so it's actually difficult for similar reasons. Let me show you two more shots. The top shot was set up by an expert, and it's a very long shot. It's almost a minute and a half. What's challenging about these is that if you make a small mistake along the way, then you're ruined and you have to start over. And to be able to not make any mistakes for that long amount of time, well, that's challenging. The bottom one, this was one of the shots that I was definitely a little apprehensive about because it gets very close to a whole lot of trees and a whole lot of obstacles. And this is one of our novices who set this up, who said, okay, I'll do something challenging. But we managed to capture this well anyway. And if I was flying that by hand, well, I would have a hell of a hard time not accidentally crashing into something. I would just be really anxious the whole time. I was anxious anyway. But so hopefully, what I'm going to convince, hopefully this gives you some idea that we can really support experts and novices to capture challenging cinematography. Then I said, well, I want to design a few shots myself and see if we can push this through a little bit. Here's the first one I came up with that combines many of these aspects. We're rotating around the building, we're doing a complex camera move, there's no straight line that we're ever flying, and we get close to things, and in fact there's no place I can stand so I can keep the Quadrotor in view, so it's very difficult for me to remain spatially aware of what's going on. That's pretty nice.
You go in between the two floors at the end?
Yeah. It fades to black for a reason. This is where we ended the project. This is a shot that Jane and I captured. What you're seeing here is something that's sped up to 10x time. So it's a time-lapse shot that we did at night. At its furthest away, the quad was over a mile away, which we, for those of you who know the regulations, we did maintain visual line of sight at all times. It was just very small. But this would be extremely challenging to capture by hand, because you're seeing this at 10x speed. This is a shot that takes over 6 minutes to capture. And so if I'm flying this by hand, if I make a small mistake, I might not even realize it until I bring the quad back, I download all this footage, and then I speed the thing up, and I say, oh, halfway, I didn't even realize, but I did a small course correction, and that ruined this. But with Horus, we can capture these things fully autonomously. I really like this. This kind of reminds me of the movie Tron. So, nice. So, in summary, it seems like you guys agree with me. We demonstrated a tool in which cinematographers could express really high-quality shots for Quadrotor cameras, even if they were novices. And we showed how we can use these 3D animation primitives and the standard look from camera model to fly Quadrotor cameras. I think of this a little bit like with Horus, the user is no longer a pilot, he's a cinematographer. He's just busy composing shots using keyframes and using curves. So if we look at the original problem we put up, well, I can get rid of two of these things. You no longer need the technical skill of flying, and you don't need to make a bunch of real-time decisions. All you need to worry about is, am I good at composing shots? And we do this by pre-planning our camera movements. Now that we can capture cinematography, let's move on to the next step. I'm going to take a stab at also making the intricacies of visual composition more accessible to novices. Now, we'll look at this in the context of something our tool isn't great for, which is filming people, where you might want to make real-time decisions depending on what people are doing, and say, well, I didn't expect this person to do this, but I want to capture that, and I don't want to go and pre-plan a new shot. I want to be able to make a real-time decision. This is work I did in collaboration also with a bunch of people in the room here, Jane, Dan from Adobe and now Google, Forain, Mike, and Pat. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm first just going to give you a little teaser of the type of things we can shoot with this. So this is a shot that we captured fully autonomously using the drone cinematographer. And there's no professional cameraman in the background here. There's just me with a little tap to fly interface. It's pretty neat. We'll get into exactly how we did this now. And first, I'm going to talk about, well, how do we just automate composition? Forget about quadrotors for a second. What do we know about visual composition? Previously, I said, let an expert handle that. But now, let's automate it. Now, it turns out there's a ton of expert knowledge in how to compose cinematic and pleasing shots. There exists all these guiding principles for visual composition. There's a taxonomy of different types of shots you can use, and all of this is captured in what's called the language of film. Now, the language of film has been developed by traditional cinematographers over the last century. Let me just give you a few examples. It's a very rich body of work, but let me give you a few examples, and you'll see that it's actually pretty easy to understand. Here's a visual composition principle I think everybody's heard about. It's called the rule of thirds. Okay. It's actually really a collection of principles. Depends on your style, depends on what you're capturing. But in the case of just capturing a profile of the subject or a portrait of the subject, it states that the subject should be placed at these attractor points. Okay, but there's two. Which one should I go for? It also suggests that, well, if the character is moving, if they're moving to the right, put them on frame left. This means you have some nice space and a feeling of spaciousness in which the character can move into. Film language also describes a set of these canonical shots that come up all the time in traditional filmmaking. I'll show you a couple simple ones, but there's actually a whole bunch. On the left, I'm showing an external shot. This is an over-the-shoulder shot where the camera is looking at the person in blue over the shoulder of the person in orange, which looks more yellow on the screen. And on the right is an internal shot, which is a close-up shot of this one person. Now, I want to point out one important thing here. Film language spends a lot of time talking about static camera locations. And in general, it's a champion for this idea of lazy cameras, that the camera should move much slower than whatever action's happening in the scene. Let me show you another visual composition principle. This one actually helps us, informs us how we should place subsequent shots, and it's called respecting the line of action, or some people might know it as the 180-degree rule. Let's say I'm capturing this external shot of our blue and orange people. Now next, I want to move my camera so that rather than seeing the face of the blue person over the orange person's shoulder, I want to do the opposite. I want to look at the orange person. Well, if I cross the line of action, something interesting happens. The orange and the blue person flips in the frame. So this is quite jarring. I'm looking at the video, I'm going, okay, expecting Pat on the left, cut happens, now Pat's on the right. So this is quite jarring. If I respect the line of action and I stay on the same side, then I can set up that same shot and we don't get this jarring cut. Now, we're not the first people to go, oh, we should use this body of work to automate camera planning. In fact, this is a paper from 1999 by Hay et al. Very classic computer graphics. Beautiful. Ducks, love it. They've used this idea to automate virtual cameras. Okay? And once again, we just need one weird trick to make this work for quadrotors. Okay? We just need to respect the physics of quadrotors and the general physicality of the situation, and then we can use similar ideas to drive quadrotors. You'll notice a pattern here. Come up with a great computer graphics idea, adapt it to quadrotors. So armed with this set of visual composition principles and canonical shots from this paper and some of the books I mentioned, I'll say, okay, here's our key idea. We can use canonical shots and these composition principles as input to a quadrotor camera. We'll, again, automate flying the quadrotor. We'll make sure that our shots and the quadrotor's movement between these shots follow these visual composition principles, so now novices can get very high quality visual composition without really understanding any of these rules. And we're going to do this all in real time so we can react to what the subjects are up to. Let me quickly just give you an idea of the canonical shots we expose to our users. In our tool, we have what's called an apex and a close apex shot that equally frames both of our subjects, just with different crops. And we adapted these shots from the virtual cinematography paper that I mentioned. We also took inspiration from a couple of other sources, but let me show you a couple more. For every subject, we also have an internal and an external shot, which you've already seen. And so these are all the shots we have, and then for each of them, we also adapt them to have a higher vantage point. So I've, from a small collection, I create quite a few shots in this tool. Let me just give you an idea of what our user interaction looks like using this tool. So this list of canonical shots is exposed in the user interface. If we want to film our two subjects, one filming them in the real world, and I want to react to what they're doing, so I'm going to put some trackers on them so I know where they are. And when the user clicks a shot and says, okay, I want that one, then we'll just go place a camera there. The camera will hover there, hold the position, capture that shot, mimicking these lazy cameras. And if you click the next shot and say, you know what, I actually want this nice external over-the-shoulder shot, well, we'll calculate the correct camera pose based on where people currently are, using all these rules of visual composition. And then we're going to find a high-quality trajectory to this new camera pose. Because this is all happening in real time, and we don't want to miss any of the action, we want to make sure that any video we capture along this trajectory is also high quality, it looks nice, and we can use it. And so we're going to take extra care to follow these visual composition principles along the trajectory. And of course, I already told you about creating feasible trajectories, so we have to make sure this is something our quadrotor can fly. And once we have this trajectory, well, I'll just throw it at the same tools that we previously built to fly quadrotors autonomously. Simple, right? Never is. We had to overcome a set of technical challenges. I'll tell you about 3 of them that's all documented in our paper. First of all, like I mentioned, if we want to film people, well, we need to track them. And it turns out that off-the-shelf methods don't quite help us. Second, we want to keep our subjects safe. So we have to be careful where we place and how we move the quadrotor. And lastly, we need to find these high-quality transitions between shots. And I'll tell you about each one of these. I'll just start talking about safety, since they're particularly way all the quadrotor cameras.
That wasn't you, man.
You guys want to see that again? So, safety is important, right? So, we're going to try to respect subject safety. And we're going to approach this problem as follows. We're going to define a safety sphere around each person, which I'm going to draw in green, like this. And we're going to calibrate the safety sphere to some value that users are comfortable with. So every person is in a little bubble that will never put a camera inside. Currently, though, I'm indicating on this graph, most of our quadrotors have fairly wide-angle cameras, kind of like the GoPro that's on this one. And so for most of these shots, if we want to capture that shot faithfully, we end up being very close to the subjects. We violate the safety sphere, so we have to do something about that. Well, what we do is we place the camera, we push the camera out along the viewing ray of this camera. And now I'm no longer accurately capturing the shot, so I'll either crop the camera, crop the sensor, or if I have a zoom lens, I'll zoom in. Here you can get a sense of all of the shots and how we adapt them to this safety consideration. The apex shot remains unchanged, it's far enough away. And this is specifically for the GoPro camera we used. The close apex, we have to push back a little bit. It's really the internal shot that we see the biggest difference between what the camera will see and so how much it will crop. Now, cropping, you're right, it does have some problems because I lose resolution when I'm cropping. But I would say this is actually still a pretty viable solution, and that's because in the last couple months, we've seen some of the major consumer quadrotor manufacturers release cameras with very good zoom lenses. So we're starting to see cameras that can actually do something like this without cropping the sensor. We're going to run into safety again. but at least for the moment, I'll say, okay, we can call these shots safe. Now next, we have to know where our subjects are so we can find these camera positions, right? So we need some way to track them. Now, it's very common for current commercial quadrotors to have what's called a follow me mode, which tracks a standard GPS like the one you have on your phone or built into the controller. And we were curious whether we can just use this, because this is literally something that's available off the shelf. And in fact, each of your cell phones have a GPS in it, right? So we ran a set of experiments to examine the accuracy of conventional GPS-based tracking, specifically in the context of the type of cinematography we want to do. Now, we found that today's state-of-the-art conventional GPS systems, as used on quadrotors and cell phones, give us an average about 2-meter error in position. And I'm really not trying to be mean to GPS here. This is a state-of-the-art GPS that does sensor fusion with a barometer and an IMU and like all the works. So, what does that mean for us, though? The real question is, what does this mean in the context of cinematography? So, what we did is we simulated our camera using this standard GPS to capture people. And we found that, on average, a position is placed about a third in screen width off. Okay, so he's about what that means is he's at about the wrong rule of thirds position. So, and I swear I'm not making this up. This just happened. Okay, which is great. So this sucks because we did all this work to make sure that we respect visual composition principles. And now we're going to use normal GPS, and never mind, your shot doesn't follow any of these visual composition principles. And even worse, we might think that we're a safe distance away, but if I'm 2 meters off, well, I might now be inside a person. So we concluded that conventional GPS is not accurate enough. So we started looking at alternatives. Now, fortunately, there's a solution. Recent advances in microprocessor technology has reduced the cost and the size of centimeter-accurate GPS technology. This GPS technology is known as real-time kinematic GPS, and the CTO of the company that builds this is actually sitting over there. So we ran the same experiments that we previously did using this GPS technology, and here's a sense of just the accuracy comparison. If you use this GPS technology, you get about 1.7 centimeters in position, or about 2 centimeters in altitude deviation, compared to the conventional, like I said, about 2 meters in position error. Numbers are hard to understand. Pictures are better. So here's a visual comparison of the two. In gray, I'm going to show you 2 tripods that we're tracking using this GPS system. In gray, we're just going to use conventional GPS, and then the textured, you can't see them right now, but in a second you'll see 2 textured people that are being tracked with RTK GPS. This is what that looks like over time. This is sped up to about 10x speed. So you can see, we calibrated everything. You said we'll start them at the right positions, and then in gray you see normal GPS wandering around, and textured people you see this RTK GPS system only having a little bit of jitter. So we used this RTK system to build an end-to-end tracking system. So we equipped both of our subjects with these very cool-looking hats. And we also built this onto our quadrotor. Okay? So not only did we track subjects, we also localized our quadrotor with this RTK GPS technology. And we have a tech report out that demonstrates how we can do quadrotor placement in outdoors in the real world to about 30 centimeters accuracy using this technology. That's actually pretty good because the state-of-the-art indoor motion capture-based systems report about a 10 centimeter accuracy in hover position. So we're not that far off from people who are in a much more controlled environment than we are. Now, when people use this testbed to do cinematography, yeah, we're using these helmets. And in some situations, this doesn't really matter much. Like if you're playing sports, you can imagine this is technology that I built in the lab up here, and if people live nicely into the helmet, maybe that's not a big deal. But it is true that in some of our shots, this is annoying to have to wear a helmet. So we think that this technology makes for a really nice test bed. But it enabled us to capture all of these shots in real scenarios, outdoors, rather than limit ourselves to working in indoor motion capture-based system. And it allowed us to get a sense of the accuracy we need to achieve. And we said, this accuracy is good enough. We don't need to get any better than this. It's also really useful as a ground truth for other methods. Everybody always asks me, why did you guys do computer vision? What about computer vision? And it's true, that is an obvious direction to go for this as well. And it's actually a very promising direction. It's an active area of research that I think has a lot of promise for us to use something like this. There's a little bit of a tricky aspect here, which is if I'm using a computer vision algorithm to track multiple people, like what we're doing, well, I need to be able to see multiple people. So if I want to use my cinematography camera for that, well, I now need to see people, all my people, all the time, and many of our shots only feature one person. So I need to do something like add additional cameras to my quadrotor or the like. So that would be an interesting research direction as well. Let's rather look at some cool shots we captured. Here's an example of two shots. On the left is, on the top is an apex shot, and on the bottom is one of these slightly higher over-the-shoulder shots. And as you can see, we're actually doing pretty well. I would say that the real cinematography we were capturing on the right matches the cinematography that we planned pretty well. Let me give you an idea of this in the real world, though, that I show you I didn't just pick the perfect frame, which I obviously did. But we're doing pretty well even in the real world, right? Let me show you that shot. Here, two people are busy playing catch, and we're doing a great job in capturing this static shot. That's really not bad for a flying machine. And I'll just show you a collection of these shots. You can see a nice variety of them. You can also see kind of the effects of cropping at its worst in the bottom left. That's a fairly close crop shot. Okay, we're almost done. We can track people, we can keep them safe, but I haven't yet showed you how we move a quadrotor between these positions. And that's what I want to know now, okay? Can we just use the same trajectories from Horus? I spent all this time telling you how we can automate a quadrotor flying between keyframes. What about we just use that? Well, we absolutely tried that, okay? In Horus, we guarantee that we respect the physics of quadrotors between keyframes. So we said, well, we'll just use these two static shots as keyframes. We get some funny results then. Well, for one, this was getting very, very close to our subject. You can see her looking a little concerned. And because we're not controlling exactly how the camera moves between these keyframes, more than just saying, well, respect the physics, follow the smooth path, we don't necessarily get the most beautiful cinematography out of them. Now, if you're working in Horus, well, you can add additional keyframes to get the movement you want. But here, we're trying to do things in real time with the tap-to-fly interface, so this doesn't really work as well. So we went in a slightly different direction. Let me define what we did. We said, well, we must move the quadrotor in a way that's feasible, obviously, that's safe, and that also produces visually pleasing video. We have to do this on demand in real time. So we have these three competing constraints. Now this is challenging for multiple reasons, but I did my favorite trick. I said, well, what does the computer graphics community do? And indeed, there's a method called the toric space, which lets you plan transitions between camera positions of people. Okay? I'll just show an example of what they did. This is from SIGGRAPH 2015. Here's an idea, here's an example of kind of how they find transitions between positions of people, on-screen positions of people. And so this is pretty great, and I think it's a total fluke, but they generate trajectories that is actually feasible for quadrotors because the trajectories are C4 continuous. In fact, it's C infinite continuous. So it kind of trivially satisfies the equations of motion for our quadrotor. And the reason why this method is so neat is that they can calculate these trajectories analytically, which means they can do it very, very quickly. They don't need to run some massive solver. Problem is, they didn't respect safety. So we kind of opened the box to the algorithm and said, well, let's take a look at how this thing works. And I'll just explain to you in the pictures. Let's say I want to find a camera path between these two positions. They analytically find nice trajectory for each person. Turns out this is pretty easy. You can think of this a little bit like they plan an orbit around a person. Say, well, if I want to keep one person at a fixed point in the frame, I can just rotate around them. And if I want to keep them at that frame, I can rotate, push my camera in, I can control them very nicely. They blend between these two in a way that nicely averages these visual effects. So you get people kind of moving nice and smooth in the frame like you see in the results. But if you look at my safety sphere, these blends will go through them. So we made a pretty surprising discovery that turns out that you can come up with a different blend in a way that respects safety and ensures feasibility, and that this blend always exists. And the proof of this is quite involved. Mike and I worked on that for a long time. But trust me that it works, and look at the paper if you want to know the details. The neat thing then is we can write down a small non-convex optimization problem, and we can find that there is some blend that is safe and that balances this concern of doing visual composition and staying outside of the safety zone. And it turns out, whenever people say, okay, non-convex solve, well, that sounds bad, you remember your convexity, but it turns out it's quite well behaved in practice, and so we can solve it in real time. Let me give you an example of what happens when we fly these trajectories. Here's an example of just transitioning from one to another external shot. And then here's that same shot being captured by our quadrotor camera in the real world. And let me just give you an example. Here is a bunch of transitions in a virtual world. So you can kind of get a sense here of how people move around in the frame. Now you get this feeling of kind of orbiting around people. Now, if we put all of this together into this tool, I can film something like this. This is a simulated graduation sequence. It's not lost on my committee. Now, there's no pilot here. There's just Niels living out his dream, tapping buttons on a tap-to-flight interface to capture all these shots. Now, I think this is pretty cool. Okay, we can set a drone loose, and we can capture a whole range of compelling shots completely automatically. Like, this is totally awesome. Okay? What's really neat here is we're using well-established rules of visual composition. So if you don't like the shots, well, don't blame me, blame Hollywood. Okay. Let me summarize. We automated high-quality visual compositions. We adopted canonical shots to ensure their safety. We validated and then tracked our subjects using state-of-the-art RTK GPS. And we introduced a real-time trajectory planning algorithm to find visually pleasing, safe, and feasible transitions. So with the drone cinematographer, the user acts a little bit like a director. They're just commanding well-known shots from the language of film. The drone cinematographer, in Horus, he was a little bit like a cinematographer, setting up compositions, while here, he's really just being Spielberg, yelling at his director of photography, saying, give me the shot, give me that shot. So let's recap. Horus removed the cognitive burden of real-time control. Okay, we remained fully expressive, and we made high-quality cinematography easier to express than using these manual control sticks. I think of this a little bit like the Photoshop of drone cinematography. If you're good with visual composition, you can do very impressive things. On the other hand, the drone cinematographer is more like Instagram. We can make high-quality visual composition accessible to novices by presenting these high-quality shots to a user. In terms of our technical contributions, in Horus, we proved that C4 continuous look from and look at trajectories and these progress curves satisfy quadrotor camera equations of motion, and we showed that computer graphics primitives enable users to capture high-quality quadrotor shots even if they're novices. With the drone cinematographer, we adopted canonical cinematography shots to ensure safety. We showed that we can track subjects with high enough accuracy for cinematography using this RTK GPS technology. And then lastly, we showed how to find visually pleasing, safe trajectories for quadrotors filming people. So we were trying to demonstrate this idea of cinematography first interaction. No longer do users have to fly a quadrotor manually or mess with mission planning tools. we provided tools that enabled novices and experts alike to capture impressive cinematography, and we did all this by incorporating quadrotor demands into these cinematography primitives. Now, I think what's so exciting is these are really just the first steps in this new area of research for computer graphics. The future is really bright. First of all, there's plenty of other cinematography primitives that I haven't exploited yet. One that I'm pretty excited about is this idea of through-the-lens drone control, where you're busy defining points on a screen and saying, put that subject here, put that subject here, and automatically find trajectories that satisfy those. If we do something like this, we can extend our tool to have an arbitrary number of people in the drone cinematographer, because I only showed you one or two. The tracking system we built is a great test bed for many other outdoor tracking systems. For example, there's a bunch of new ones coming out, like ultra-wideband short-range tracking, which can give you centimeter accuracy without having to have any sky views. That'll work both indoors and outdoors. There's also a bunch of exciting sensor fusion ideas, like combining LiDAR and GPS and computer vision, that can ultimately help us track people without having to place a tracker on them.